makers, Lisa here from Andrie Designs. In this video I'm going to show you how to cut bias strips, how to assemble them and how to create piping. Despite many fears, it's actually really easy to do, and once you've done it a couple of times you'll be wondering why you never tried it sooner. I hope you find this video helpful. I hope you learn a few little tips and tricks, and let's get started. Okay, so to begin, you want to take your fabric that you're going to be making your piping out of, and I like to lie it right side up, but it really doesn't matter. You can have it wrong side up if you prefer. And if you have quite a length of fabric, I like to work from a bottom corner, and I will have the excess fabric hanging off the edge, the top edge of my table, so that it's out of the way. So I'm left-handed, so I'm going to show you what I do being a left-hander. If you're right-handed, you'll simply want to do this in the opposite direction. So I work in the bottom right-hand corner of my fabric, and I'm making sure it's nice and flat and fairly square on my cutting board. I'm simply going to take my bottom right-hand corner. So remember, if you're right-handed, you'll be taking your bottom left-hand corner, and I'm going to fold it up to make a nice 45-degree line across the fabric, okay? I usually fold it to about halfway and just smooth it all out. It doesn't have to be too perfect there. Then what you're going to do is take your rotary cutter or your scissors, whatever you prefer, and you're simply going to cut it off, to cut the excess fabric off so that you've just got this square essentially, which is now folded into a triangle, which is what you're going to use to make your, or to cut your bias strips and then make your piping. Okay, so taking your rotary cutter or scissors, just cut the excess fabric off. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't need to use a ruler. It's just simply to remove it. So we can put that to the side because we don't need that now. So keeping your fabric folded in a triangle, you're going to take your top folded corner and you're going to fold it down to meet the bottom folded corner, so that down this edge you have two folded edges nicely meeting. Okay, now you're going to take these bottom two folded corners and you're going to take them back across to meet the main fold there in the center, just ensuring your fabric stays nice and flat. So you'll see that now you have four folded edges all meeting nicely. That is exactly what we're after, and we're actually going to cut that off in just a moment. So as you'll see, if you gently pull at the fabric, it stretches really nicely. That is the bias of the fabric, and that is what we're going to then cut our bias strips from. So taking your folded fabric, leaving it folded as it is, you just need to rotate it around so that the four folded edges are to one side. So here they are. Because I'm left-handed, I'm going to cut them off, so I want those on my left-hand side. However, if you're right-handed, you'll want your fabric 180 degrees the other way, so you can cut them off to that side. So I'll just flip that back round. So just grab your ruler, and all you want to do is make sure that either a line at the top or a line at the bottom horizontally is in line with the folds of the fabric. Don't worry about trying to line this edge up because we're actually about to cut that off, but you want to make sure that either a line across the top or across the bottom is nice and square with your folded fabric. Once you're happy with that, and you've got no more than about 1/4 of an inch poking out here and all four folds are off the edge of the ruler, just take your rotary cutter and cut those off. Now that is rubbish, we don't need that anymore, so we can put that to the side. And now you'll have, keeping your fabric folded, you'll have nice, perfectly cut raw edges of the fabric on the bias. So turn your fabric 180 degrees back the other way so that you're now cutting it correctly. And you want to pop your ruler on it and cut strips the width as per your pattern directions. So for the pattern I'm making, I need to cut 1.5 inch strips, which will suit this thicker cotton cording that I'm going to make the piping out of. Okay, so for thinner cording, you'll need to cut narrower strips, but for mine, I'm cutting 1.5 inches wide. And you just want to make sure that your mark on your ruler is nicely squared up with the beautiful cut edge that we've just made. Try and get those bias strips as equal as possible all the way along. Once you've lined it up, simply cut it off, nice and straight through. And if you open it out, you will find you have two pieces of fabric. Cut just like that, and if you give it a gentle pull, you'll see it has a nice amount of give. That's because the fabric has been cut on the bias or on the diagonal of the fabric, and it will make it really easy once we've made the piping to curve round corners of your bag panels. So that is how we cut our fabric strips ready to make the piping. If you need more length for your pattern, you'll need to just work your way along your fabric and cut off the strips as per your pattern directions. So once you've done that, pause the video while you go and do that, and then pop back here and we'll start to assemble our bias strips. Okay, so taking your bias strips that you've just cut off your bulk of fabric, first, before we stitch them together, we want to tidy up these ends so that they're nice and square, and that will cut off any salvage or any raw edges that you have already got there. So just taking your ruler and your rotary cutter, make sure you line up one of the horizontal lines on your ruler with one of the cut edges of a bias strip as close as you can to the end, so you're just cutting off the salvage or that angled edge, and we're just going to cut that off. Okay, so you want to go through and repeat that for each end of each bias strip so that they are nice squared off ends ready to stitch together. We'll just make it a little bit easier when you come to stitch them together. So just like that, and then you want to repeat on the other end of your bias strips as well. So pause the video and come back when you've done that. So once you've trimmed both ends of each bias strip so they're nice and square, we're ready to assemble our strips into one continuous length. So the best way to do this, I found, is to join the pieces on a 45-degree angle. That helps distribute the bulk from the seams. Although it's very minimal, it helps to distribute it when you come to wrap your fabric around the cord, and almost makes the seams near invisible and very hard to see. So to begin, just take two of your strips, so it doesn't matter which two, and you might notice that my strips are quite nice and flat now because I've actually just given them a quick press. So if your fabric's anything like mine, when you pull it out of storage, it's usually got some lovely creases through it. It doesn't bother me, the creases, when I'm cutting, but when I come to this stage and I'm ready to stitch them together and then create my piping, I like my fabric to be nice and flat. So I've just given each strip a quick press. I haven't pulled it or stretched it, I've just laid it on my pressing table, flattened it out to get rid of the wrinkles, and it's nice and flat, ready to assemble now. So taking two strips, you want to lie your first strip horizontally. So being a left-hander, I'm going to work on, or I prefer to work on the right-hand end, and I'm just going to have the excess running horizontally off to the left. Remember, if you're right-handed, you may prefer to have it running in the opposite direction. So your first strip is right side up, horizontally across your work surface. Take a second strip and place it right sides down so that the two fabrics will be right sides together. In this bottom corner, you want to line the two pieces up so that this edge and this edge match together, and this corner in here is perfectly matched as well. So you've got a nice right angle going on with your fabric strips. Taking your tailor's chalk and a ruler, you're going to draw a stitching line from this top corner that's poking out underneath, from the underneath piece of bias, and you're going to rule it from that top corner down to this bottom corner here on this top piece of bias that you can see. So it's going to be a nice 45-degree stitching line, and you're just going to draw that with your tailor's chalk and then pin it in place. If you have further lengths like I do, what you'll need to do is take this top vertical piece and you're going to fold it over and out, which is going to become the new horizontal piece. Take another piece of bias, place it right side down so the two fabrics in this bottom corner are right sides together. Again, matching this outside edge here and this one here. You're going to take your tailor's chalk and your ruler and you're going to draw a stitching line and pin in place. So you want to repeat this process for each join on your bias strips until all of them are pinned, ready for stitching. So for me, I have one more strip, so I'm going to take my vertical, flip it over so it's right side up, and move it, the bulk of it, out to the left so I have my new horizontal strip, and take my last bias strip, place it right side down so my corners are together, nice and square. I'm going to draw my stitching line and I'm going to pin in place. So now that all my bias strips are pinned together and I have my stitching lines drawn, we're going to head over to the machine and we're going to sew these together. Okay, so at your sewing machine, you want to start by ensuring that you have a thread that matches your fabric. So I'm using a nice blue fabric, so I've got a blue thread loaded and ready to go. You want your stitch length to be around 2 to 2.5 millimeters, and all we're going to do simply is stitch along those lines we drew earlier, working from one corner to the other on a 45-degree angle. So something to remember is you do not need to reverse at the start and end of these seams. It's an unnecessary step, and as you'll find later, it's actually really not needed as long as your stitch length is 2 to 2.5 millimeters, no longer. So working down those lines we drew earlier, you just want to stitch them as straight as you can all the way to the edge. And take your seam out and it looks pretty good. So it doesn't matter if your stitching is slightly wonky, it is a little bit tricky to get a nice straight seam given that you're stitching on the bias of the fabric, so it does want to stretch and move a little bit, but as long as it's relatively straight, working from one corner to the other, then you'll be good to go. So pause the video and repeat to stitch all the rest of your seams and then resume the video once you've done that. Okay, so what we want to do now is back at your cutting table, you want to trim the corner of each join off using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You also want to trim off those excess threads as well. So just grab your ruler, line it up so it's a 1/4 inch out from the seam you've just sewn and cut it off. Okay, and that'll give you a nice straight edge at each join. So you want to go ahead and repeat that for each seam that you've made on your length of bias and then pop back here for the next part. So once you've trimmed the corner off each join in your bias strips, just pop over to your pressing table and press each seam open. Okay, not to one side, you want to press them nice and flat open. Try not to stretch the fabric because you don't want to press it out of shape. Just pressing the seam nice and flat, just like mine. Now also, if you haven't pressed your bias strips at this stage or as yet, this is probably a really good time just to give them a quick wee press to get any wrinkles out, because the next part is the fun part. We're going to enclose our cord in our beautiful bias strip, and it just makes it that much easier if your fabric on your bias strip is nice and flat to begin with. So once you've pressed your strip and you've pressed all your joining seams open, it's time to head back to the machine and create our piping. Okay, so at your sewing machine, you want to ensure that you have your zip foot or piping foot attached. You want to ensure your stitch length is around 3.5 millimeters, slightly longer than normal, but not quite a basting stitch length. Taking your bias strip, make sure you have the fabric right side down, so you're looking at the wrong side of the fabric. Take your cotton cording and just lay it over top down the middle with about 1 inch poking out the end. I like to have that 1 inch out because sometimes you'll find once your strip is stitched, due to the stretch in the bias, if you have your cord right on the edge, sometimes it can disappear down into the tube, and I'm not really a fan of unpicking, so I like to just make sure that I have about 1 inch poking out so I have something to grab and I can ensure that it's not going to disappear in case my bias strip stretches. So what you want to do is take your bias strip and you're just going to fold it over the cotton cord, wrong sides together, and you want to match the long raw edges of your strip together. Now some people will prefer to pin this in place prior to stitching, which is absolutely fine. I prefer to assemble it and stitch it as I go, and that's just a personal preference. So I've got my end of the cord poking out, ready to go. I folded my strip in half with these long edges matching, wrong sides together. I'm just going to pop it under my foot, and I'm going to grab the tail of my threads because I don't want them to disappear down just while we get started. And a little tip here is to make sure you have your needle in the needle down position so that every time you stop, your work is held in place. So we're just going to make a few stitches. Now you don't need to reverse for this. You're just going to make a few stitches holding the tail of your threads so they don't disappear down into your feet or the feed dog area. And we've begun. As you stitch down, you want to ensure that the long raw edges are matched the whole way down and that your cord is sitting in the nice fold of the fabric. As you stitch it, it's not overly imperative that you stitch hard up against the cord. That's going to come later when you attach your piping to your bag panels. So for now, you just want to whiz down the side, somewhat close to the cord, but it's not imperative that you stitch hard up against it. And pausing every now and again to readjust, refold, check those edges are matching, and let it feed through. So checking the edges are matching, I just hold them with my fingers and feed it through. And again, check the edges are matching, hold it with your fingers and stitch down. So continue doing that, pause this video and continue stitching the entire length of your cotton cord into your bias strip so that you have a nice assembled piece of piping. And there you have it, a beautiful length of piping created and ready to use on your next bag panel. Hi bag makers, Lisa here from Andrie Designs. Today I have a free tutorial for you on attaching piping. So I'm working on the Adventure Time backpack pattern and I'll pop a link to that pattern in the description below for those of you who are interested. I will show you how to attach piping to a single panel that has a start and a finish. I will also show you how to attach piping in a continuous loop. And to finish, I will show you how to finish off the piping by attaching the second panel to the other side so you have your piping securely held between two panels. So with all of that said, let's get started. So today I'm going to show you how I like to attach piping to panels and then how I like to secure it in the seam when I'm then attaching the second panel to the other side of the piping. I'm going to be working on this assembled back panel for the Adventure Time backpack. I'll pop a link to this pattern in the description below for those of you interested. So I'm going to attach the piping around the outside of this panel. I personally prefer to align and stitch the piping at the sewing machine. However, if you are someone who would rather pin it or clip it in place first, this is what you will need to do. Working from one bottom corner to the other, you're going to stitch up this first side. So I'm going to pin or clip my piping in place along that edge first. I like to have a little bit of an overhang just so that it's there. It'll get trimmed off later. I just find that it's just a bit more reliable than right up hard against the edge. No more than about 1/4 of an inch or so. And all you're going to do is place your clips along the piping, keeping it fairly taut, not stretching it out, but not leaving it too loose and sloppy either. You're just going to lay it along the edge, matching raw edges of the piping to raw edges of the panel you're attaching it to, and clip evenly around. Okay, you're going to continue all the way around. When you come to a corner, because you've cut your fabric on the bias, it's naturally going to curve. It's going to curve very easily. However, you may find you need to make small snips with your scissors about 1/2 inch in spacing along the curve to help the fabric to turn more easily. So if you're finding that you're having trouble stretching the fabric right out to ensure the raw edges meet, feel free to make small snips about 1/2 inch apart and no more than about 1/4 inch into the bias to help ease that fabric around the corner. So if that is your case and you are pinning or clipping, go ahead and pause the video and prepare the rest of your panel. Otherwise, for people like me who rather just hold it up against the panel and whack it on at the sewing machine, let's pop over to the machine and I'll show you how I do it. So at your sewing machine, you need to ensure you have your zipper foot or piping foot attached. You have thread loaded that matches the color of your piping. Your needle is set to the needle down position and you are using a normal stitch length of about 2 to 2.5 millimeters. To start, you're going to line up the edge of your piping, the raw edge, with the raw edge of your panel, and again having a slight overhang at the end. Pop that under your foot and you're going to line up the foot hard up against the cotton cording that you can feel in your bias. As close as you can get it, however, because this is in the seam allowance, a little bit out won't matter at this point. We just need to get started. We're just going to make a couple of stitches forward and a couple of stitches back just to get going. Again, stopping with the needle in the needle down position. I like to hold on to the tails to help pull the panel through so that nothing gets sucked down into the feed dogs as I go. Once you've started, you need to ensure that you always keep the raw edge of the bias in line with the raw edge of your panel, and that your foot runs as close as you can to the cotton cording within your bias as you go. To attach the piping, all you need to do is simply stitch along the inner edge of that cording, adjusting the bias and piping as you go. So I just always stop with the needle down, rearrange the piping as I go, and stitch hard up against that cotton cording to lock it in place. I always stop in the needle down position so I know my work is not going to move anywhere on me, and I readjust as need be as I work my way around the panel. As you'll see, I just use my fingers to align the piping and then hold it in place, and as I work up to my fingers I simply move them out of the way, and then I stop and I readjust. When you get to a corner, if it's a nice gentle corner, you can normally just stretch the fabric and stitch around it without having to make any cuts. However, sometimes you'll have a tight corner, such as the end of the straps on the backpack. These are very tight corners. So you'll need to make snips in the piping as you go to allow the fabric to turn more smoothly. To do that, all you need to do is grab a pair of snips and make small little cuts about 1/2 inch apart and 1/4 inch deep into the bias, not into the panel that you're attaching the piping to, just into the bias fabric. Once you've done that, you'll find your fabric turns more easily, and you can just hold it in place and continue to stitch around the corners of your panel. When you get to the end, all you need to do is finish off as you would for a normal seam. Just back stitching a couple of times and remove. And that is the first part in attaching piping. What you'll need to do is just have a feel around your seam, rolling it out with your thumb to check you're happy with how tight the cotton cording has been enclosed in the seam. If you've gone a little bit wider and you haven't hugged the cording as tight as possible, you may find there's a bit of slop and a bit of movement in your piping, in which case all you need to do is pop your panel back under your foot and just try and stitch a little bit closer to that cording to really lock it in place. Once you're happy with your cording and how it is sitting and attached to your panel, what I really like to do, especially around corners, is run a basting stitch about 1/8 to 1/4 inch in from the raw edge to help hold these little fluffy bits down. This will just help when you assemble your panel later on. This will help keep everything nice and flat and nice and tidy, ready for that process. So all I do on my machine is I move my needle all the way to the other side. I increase my stitch length to as long as it will go. So on my machine it's 5 mil. I have my needle in the needle down position, and I'm just going to stitch a basting stitch just inside that raw edge to hold those little clipped corners in place so they don't move on me later. And that looks really good. So that is the first part of attaching piping. We'll pop back in just a moment and I'll show you how to secure it between the second panel that goes over top to get a really nice tight finish with your piping. If you need to attach piping to a panel such as the outer base on the Adventure Time backpack, that will result in one continuous loop of piping. The process at the start and finish is slightly different, however the rest of it is pretty much the same as if you're attaching it to one edge where there is a definite start and finish. So all you need to do to attach piping in one continuous loop is take your length of piping and you're going to unpick approximately 2 inches of the stitching from the end of the piping. Doesn't have to be exact, just sort of eyeball it and take those stitches out. Next you need to open up the bias and you're going to cut the cording out just above where the stitching ends. You're cutting off around just under 2 inches of cord, and that can be discarded. Next you need to fold your bias over so it's wrong sides together to create a finished edge or a folded edge. Just finger press that to flatten it out. Tuck that in so it's flat against itself and refold your bias. So now you have where the cord was sitting, you have a nice folded edge here, and you also have a nice folded edge across the end as well. Next, what you want to do is choose a starting and ending point on your panel. If you have directional fabric, this will usually be the back or the bottom of your fabric. However, for mine, it's not overly directional given it's the base of the bag, so I'm just going to choose to start here in the middle of the panel. What you're going to do is you're going to align your piping with raw edge of the bias, matching raw edge of the panel, just like you did before for your non-continuous loop. However, when you start stitching, instead of starting right at the end of the fabric, you're going to start about 2 inches down. This will be attached at the end rather than at the beginning. If you're someone who likes to clip or pin, go ahead and clip or pin your piping all the way around and just leave a little bit at the very end free, as we will attach that at the sewing machine once we get there, once we've stitched it in place. If you're someone like me who would rather position and stitch as you go, feel free to come with me. We'll pop over to the sewing machine and I'll show you how I attach this and how I then secure the end to give a nice tidy finish. So at the machine you're going to align the raw edge of the piping with the raw edge of the panel, and you're going to start stitching about 2 inches in from that nice finished edge that we've recently created. Make sure you have your needle in the needle down position, make a couple of stitches and then continue all the way around the panel just like we did before, aligning the raw edge of the piping with the raw edge of the panel and making snips in the corners as you go around. Once you get back to where you started, what you want to do first is keep this, refold your fold if it's come out like mine has, and just lie that flat down on your panel where it's going to sit once it's stitched. Laying your extra length of piping over top, you just want to feel in the channel of the piping that's already attached to where the cotton cording ends approximately. So I can feel with my nail that it ends about there. So then I'm going to cut the excess piping off just past that. So I want to have a little bit to play with, so I'm going to cut it just past. My snips will work. And we can discard that extra length of piping. From here, what we're going to do is we're going to lift the foot up. Remember, you've got your needle down, so it's holding your work in place. And you're going to carefully open up that beginning of the piping, keeping the fold folded and keeping the raw edges aligned with the raw edge of your panel as best you can. You're then going to lie the end of your piping in the groove, in the fold, because essentially what we're going to do is then enclose it and stitch to secure. Before we do that, however, we need to make sure that the cotton cord ends are nicely butted up against each other, not overlapped, because overlapped will create a bit of bulk. So now that we've got rid of the end of our piping, we've reduced bulk somewhat. As you can see, my end of my piping comes slightly past the end of the cord, so I need to trim off maybe 1/8 of an inch just to bring it back slightly to about here, so that the end of the cord will butt up nicely against the end of the cord that's already attached. So I'm just going to go and do that. So now if I lay my attached piping back down, you can see that the end, my finished end of my piping sits nicely it butts up right against the start of the cording. So keeping my folded edge of the bias nice and flat, I'm going to lay my finished end of the piping over top, and I'm going to fold the rest of the bias over top to create a nice finished edge. Using my fingernail, I'm just going to ensure that the cording is really nicely sitting in that fold. I'm going to lower my foot. I'm still just holding this all in place with my fingers, and I'm going to stitch up and over it. I like to stop just before I get to the fold of the fabric and just ensure and just sort of push it back so that it's not bunched up under the stitching. Still stitching nice and close to the cording as you go to get a nice tight finish. And once that beginning and end is secured, you're just going to stitch all the way back to the beginning to finish off. You can remove your panel, and what you'll have is a nice overlap of bias, and you should have a nice join in there. It should be hard to feel because you've put the cotton cord right up against each other to secure that in place. If you need to, or if you feel like you need it a bit tighter, you can always run your foot a little bit closer to that cord to really help lock it in place. However, for my panel, that looks really good. I'm really happy with that. So just running your thumbs around the piping again to make sure it's nice and tight in place. And as I said earlier with the corners, just all I'm going to do, I'm going to trim these ends off. All I'm going to do is move my needle all the way to the other side, increase my stitch length as long as it will go, and I'm just going to run around the whole of my panel using a basting stitch just to secure these corners in place. What you can do from here just to tidy up the edge of the piping, if you turn your panel over to the wrong side, you'll see that you've got your bias overhanging slightly just from where it's joined. So you can just take your snips or your rotary cutter and just trim that off so it's nice and flush with the edge. and your panel is ready to go and ready to be assembled into the bag you're making. To finish the process of attaching piping, we're going to stitch the seam twice. Prior to doing that, you need to make sure that your second panel, the panel that goes on the other side of the piping, is pinned or clipped in place. So in my case, I'm working on the Adventure Time backpack. I have my front panel, I have my back gusset, and earlier I attached the piping to the front panel, and now I've clipped my back gusset in place all the way around the outer edge, making sure my raw edges are nicely aligned and my corners and center point are all matched up nice and together, ready to stitch. So what we're going to do is we're going to pop to the machine and we're going to stitch this outer edge twice. The first time we stitch it, we're going to stitch it right way up, so as I've clipped it, and we're going to make sure that we use a colour on the top that matches our piping. However, on the bottom for the bobbin thread, we're going to use a different colour. So I will probably be using a white. The second time we stitch it, we're then going to stitch looking at the other side of the panel. This is where the difference in bobbin thread colour comes in. We will then change the thread back to the, in my case, to the pink to match the piping, and we will follow our original stitch line that we made when we attached the piping back in the beginning to the panel. This is our guide and this is what we're going to follow, and we know that by stitching directly over that, we are stitching nice and snug to the cord, even though we may not be able to feel it due to the thickness of fabric, fleece, foam, or whatever's in the way. This will give it a really nice strong seam because it will have been stitched twice, and we know that by stitching it from both sides of the panel, we will be nice and snug next to that cotton cording. It will be nicely locked in place, and when we turn our bag right side out, we will have a beautiful piped edge. So pop over to your machine and we'll do the first line of stitching looking at the panels from this side up. So at my machine, I have my needle set to the needle down position. I have a normal stitch length set of about 2.5 millimeters on my machine. I have pink thread on the top to match my piping. So I've got hot pink piping, and I've changed my bobbin thread to a white. This is so that I can see my bobbin once I've stitched the first line, and that means that when we then stitch looking at this side or the underside of the panel, we can easily see the pink from when we attach the piping in the very beginning, and we can follow that without having a second row of stitching there to confuse us. So starting at the very edge of your panels, we're just going to lower the foot, making sure the needle is in the needle down position. Just going to make a few stitches forward and back to reinforce the start of my stitching, and then we're away. So if you've got panels like I do, you've got foam or fleece and several layers of fabric, it can be a little bit tricky to feel the cotton cording underneath. So we just want to make sure as we work along that we keep the raw edges together and we feel the cord as best we can, stitching along the edge there. Part of the reason we do a second row is so that we can then go over top of our very original stitching to get really nice and close up to that piping. This first row is essentially it's a basting stitch to join the panels together. However, we use a normal stitch length, not a basting stitch length, just to provide a bit of extra support for the seam, especially when you're making something like the Adventure Time backpack and there's a lot of layers in bulk. So taking it nice and slow, working your way along. We're just going to work up. I know that the cotton cording is in there, and I can actually feel it with my nail on my left hand, so I can kind of visualize where I'm stitching despite not being able to feel it all that well. That's what the second row of stitching will help us do. It will help us get right up to that cotton cording. So just work your way all the way around the panel, and then we will turn it over and stitch the second row. Once you get to the end, just reinforce to finish off your stitching and remove your panel. Obviously, if you don't have a lot of layers, if you don't have fleece or foam, you will actually be able to feel the cording in there with your finger and be able to get a lot closer. So for this type of pattern, the Adventure Time backpack, there's a lot of layers and it is a little bit tricky to feel that cording, so I've just stitched as best I can up to it. However, I know that if I was to have a look now, there's some gaps which I wouldn't be happy with. So that's why I always, regardless of the thickness, regardless of what I'm doing, I always stitch a second row with the panel turned over, looking at the other side. So as you can see the white is the row I've just stitched now, and the pink is the original row that I stitched when I first attached the piping to the panel. So I've done not too bad. There's a few gaps where I've gone a little bit wide or a little bit narrow. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that up now. And that one I've actually gone too close to the piping, so I'm going to have to unpick that section because I'm not happy with that. However, I'm going to change my bobbin over to my pink, and I'm going to stitch my second row of stitching directly over top of the pink that I stitched in the very beginning to attach my piping to my front outer panel. So now that my bobbin thread is changed over, so I have both pink again matching my piping, I'm going to stitch looking at the other side of my panel, and I'm going to follow that original row of pink that I made in the very beginning. For places such as on this corner where my white bobbin has come in and I know that it is actually encroached on the cotton cording slightly, I'm going to unpick that section once I've stitched this seam. So I'm going to stitch this seam first so that I know my cording and my piping is really nice and secure, and then I'll go back and tidy those other areas up afterwards. So making sure your needle's in the needle down position as always. Make a few stitches to start. And then working your way all around the panel directly over top of the original stitching you made when you attached your piping to the panel. And once you get to the end, reinforce your stitching and finish off. So now, as you can see, as an example of what I'm talking about, the white bobbin here, if you can see that, is the stitching we made prior to this row. And it's pretty close to the cording, but it's not close enough for my standards. I like my piping to be a really snug fit. So the pink stitching here is the row I've just stitched directly over top of the original stitching that I made to attach the piping. So you can see it's only 1 or 2 millimeters, but it makes a huge difference when you turn the panel right side out. Another example down the bottom here, you can see the white is the stitching we made prior, and that's pretty close again, but it's not quite close enough. So the pink that we've just made is stitched directly over top of the pink that we made in the very beginning when we attached the piping to the panel, and it's much closer, which means that if we open this out, we have a really nice snug fit with the piping between the front panel and the side panel, or the back gusset I should say. So that's really nice and snug. I don't need to restitch that. I don't need to go along and feel it and restitch any spots, because I know that I've stitched over my original stitching, so the piping is held in place really well. I will go back and fix up the little parts that I went a bit too wide on, but that happens on occasion, especially on bags like this, where you have several layers of fabric, some foam, bit of elastic and all sorts thrown in there. And just like that, piping! It really is that easy. After a few practices, you'll be wondering why you waited this long to give it a go. So I hope you found this video helpful, and I hope you've learned some new tips and tricks. Feel free to hit the subscribe button so you're notified of new videos as they're uploaded. And until next time, happy sewing!